Two of the three best-selling games in the Resident Evil franchise are also its worst ones, at least as mainline entries go, because Resident Evil 5 and 6 are number 1 and 3 in the franchise's all-time sales. And Capcom still decided to toss it all away. Resident Evil is one of the most popular franchises of all time. There have been over 30 games made for the series, and it has been adapted to books, comics, and of course, movies. Just by going through the numbers, Resident Evil 5 and 6 could be considered as the peak of the series' popularity. A lot of other companies would have kept putting out games to slightly diminishing results. People were obviously going to buy them, but the truth was that Resident Evil's quality was dipping. I'm sure by now you're tired of listening to how important of a game Resident Evil 4 was. It revolutionized third-person shooters, and it's still one of the standard bearers for the genre. Resident Evil 5, on the other hand, represented a significant drop in quality from its predecessor. It introduced co-op, which was a largely unwelcome addition, and for whatever reason, it took its silly little story very seriously. Like Chris Redfield punching a boulder is played as a very pivotal moment in the heat of the action, and Resi 6 just completely jumps the shark. It tries to be a big blockbuster game, but fails miserably. It's still fun, but mostly for all the wrong reasons. So Capcom did something brave. They scrapped everything from a genre they essentially created and went back to basics. With Resident Evil Requiem right around the corner, there won't be a better time to tell the story of how Resident Evil saved itself. Our story begins in 2012, when Capcom, fresh off having shipped Resi 6, had two options regarding the franchise's next installment. Option 1 was to make Resident Evil 7 more of the same. It might have sold 13 million copies instead of 15, but that's still a lot. Who cares if it's going to be critically panned? Ubisoft and other companies get away with that every year. Why not Capcom? And that's what they started going with initially. But very quickly in development, Capcom saw that this approach was not really working. So they decided to go with option 2, start fresh. All ideas were on the table. One of the most prevalent ones was making something very close to Resident Evil 4, but instead of Spain, it would be set in Portugal. Incredible creativity on display here. Something that I've omitted thus far is that Resi 6 was not the only Resi game released in 2012. Earlier in the year, we had the release of Resident Evil Revelations. Now, Revelations didn't sell well, being originally made for the 3DS of all things, but it was received much better critically. It was proof that there was still an audience out there that wanted Resi to be scary again. The development of Resi 7 was not going well until Capcom CEO Kenzo Tsujimoto personally appointed franchise producer Jun Takeuchi to fix things. Now, Takeuchi found Resi 7 in a dire state. There was basically an ongoing war between the game's development team and the marketing team. The marketing team wanted Resi 7 to check a bunch of boxes. It had to be multiplayer, had to have microtransactions, and of course had to be live service. All the things players want, of course. Takeuchi came in and started removing all of those boxes one by one. He also chose Koshi Nakanishi to direct the game, the same person who directed Revelations. A lot of the leadership that worked on 6 would not return for the series' next installment. Some would go on to other projects like the Resident Evil 2 remake, and others, like its director Eiichiro Sasaki, would not direct another game ever again. During this whole soul-searching phase, horror games as a whole were also changing. They were moving away from the over-the-shoulder perspective and adopting a first-person view. Think games like Amnesia, Outlast, Alien Isolation, and of course PT, which became an overnight sensation. Capcom would also choose to make Resi 7 a first-person game. Now, they have explicitly denied looking at PT and deciding to follow it, stating that the decision to go first-person was made before PT Shadow Drop. And while I do believe that, you can't tell me that they didn't draw a bit of inspiration from it, since the early sections of Resi 7 heavily resemble PT. I mean, look at these hallways. There wasn't even a sliver of inspiration there? The inspiration that's given instead is Sam Raimi's The Evil Dead, just like every other horror game ever. From this point onwards, development would go fairly smoothly, or at least as smoothly as creating a game from scratch can go. A new in-house engine would be used, and at some point in development, they also decided to make Resi 7 playable in VR. In late 2016, a few months before the game launched, we got the kitchen demo, a terrifying VR exclusive appetizer for the main game that really set the stage for what was about to come. And when Resident Evil 7 Biohazard finally launched on January 24th, 2017, it was amazing. Unlike 6, 7 is pure horror. Well, at least its first half, but we'll get to that later. You play as Ethan Winters, who receives a video from his long-lost wife that explicitly tells him to not come and find her. As every person being told not to do something, Ethan obliges and immediately drops everything to go find her in a decrepit mansion in a remote location somewhere in Louisiana. Ethan then almost immediately gets captured by the Bakers, a family of disgusting superhumans that also have the power to regenerate and may also be performing some interesting experiments in their basement. Ethan's objective is simple: find Mia and get out. Resi 7's intro is so effective. Exploring the claustrophobic corridors of the house by yourself, being attacked by a chainsaw-wielding Mia, and finally meeting the family, this intro is not only good at showing you that this isn't Resi 6 anymore, but also to get you invested in the story. What follows is Ethan needing to explore both the mansion and the outhouse in his attempt to escape while being chased by the members of the family. This part of Resi 7 is probably as close to perfect as any horror game can be. Except those flies at the outhouse. Nobody likes them. It's a genuinely terrifying experience. Exploring the house is tense, knowing that around each corner could mean being found by the Bakers. It's basically a big game of hide and seek. There are regular enemies as well, but they're not the traditional ones you'd find in other games of the series. They're these mold creatures that take give or take 75 bullets to kill. You'd think that finding a pistol would make the game easier, but that thing is about as effective as a normal attack on a ghost Pokemon. All of this is exacerbated by Ethan having the running capability of an out-of-prime turtle. You'd assume that he'd be faster than the 8 feet tall axe-wielding monster, but not really. It feels like he's running on quicksand, making being discovered a lot worse. Exploration is very rewarding, however. Even finding an extra clip of ammo can make you feel like you've gained a massive advantage over the enemy. The game also makes great use of liminal spaces as well. Being alone in these big houses can oftentimes be scarier than seeing the monsters themselves. Biohazard is great at building tension, and with its story also being shrouded in mystery, it makes for a perfect combination. All this applies for the first part of the game, but then you enter Lucas's domain and the game takes a severe dip in quality. Gone is the hide and seek gameplay, replaced by a section inspired by the Saw movies. This is followed by a section where you run around a ship with an assault rifle, before culminating in the legally mandated secret lab section that's in every Resident Evil game. And while the game is still fun, it replaces incredibly well executed horror for decent action. When developing RE7, Capcom wanted each family member to represent a different type of horror. But it's difficult to feel scared when you have an assault rifle and a grenade launcher. What's not helping is the story. It loses all of its mystique as it reveals every little detail about the Bakers and falls back on classic Resident Evil lore about viruses and experiments and whatnot. The game is made actively worse by having the entire mystery revealed. The story was good when it didn't feel like Resi, when we didn't know why the Bakers were mutated monsters. And learning all this information just doesn't help. It's ironic, but the game became worse when it started being more like the other games in its own franchise, because the story in Resident Evil games has never really been all that good. I like Resident Evil when it feels somewhat grounded. The stakes are a bit lower, but it feels a lot more personal. But in almost every Resi game I've played, it feels as if we come to a point where the story has to involve viruses and labs, and it just becomes infinitely less interesting. The result is having the best story moments and the best level of the games right at the start. Think like the police station in RE2 or the streets of RE3. The mansion in Biohazard is unfortunately no different. I'd say the only exceptions to this rule are Resi 4 and Village, but they were far from grounded in reality in the first place. In a cruel twist of fate, Biohazard sold less copies than RE6. It still sold 16 million copies and will probably overtake it within 2026. The game was also received incredibly well by both critics and fans alike, and so a sequel was obviously in order. Despite being hampered by the pandemic, Resident Evil Village also had a pretty smooth development process. However, the team started making Village with a very different mindset. Village's producer Tsuyoshi Kanda said that Capcom received a lot of player feedback that RE7 was too scary, that the first half of the game made them not want to play it, and even if they did get through it, they would be desensitized to later scares. I'm sure them having the weapon arsenal of a small army had nothing to do with that. So Capcom decided that Village would try to loosen up a bit on the scares and pace them out a bit. Gone would also be the claustrophobic environments of Biohazard, instead replaced by the more open areas of the Village. Now, there's two ways to critique Village. One is through the lens of what I personally wanted, and the other is just to critique it for what it's trying to be. What I wanted was a proper sequel to Skate 3, but we can't have everything, I guess. The second thing that I wanted was for Village to fully commit to RE7's horror. It instead does the opposite, leaning towards the more action-oriented parts of the game. When I originally played it in 2021, I was admittedly disappointed, but replaying it now, it's a really good game. You once again play as Ethan, who, having saved Mia, they decide to settle in their new life in Romania alongside their newborn daughter Rose. It's at this point that Chris Redfield kills Mia and kidnaps Rose. But before he can get far, Redfield gets intercepted by the local residents who kidnap Rose from him. Ethan then must go to the village and defeat 4 lords that all have Rose at a separate location, and no, I will not be elaborating further on that statement. The game is a lot closer to Resident Evil 4 in style. It's significantly less scary than RE7, but what it loses in horror, it gains in excellent gunfights against a lot of enemies. The gunfights in this game are great. Guns finally feel like they have an impact, and Ethan even learned how to use his feet. Village also has the advantage of having pretty consistent quality across its entire runtime. I can't say I was ever really scared though. I think they went a bit too light on the pacing, with the obvious exception being the 1 hour you spent in House Beneviento. House Beneviento is randomly one of the best pieces of psychological horror you will find anywhere. For the most part, the house is empty, but you don't know that, and that creeping dread that someone is always watching you perform these grotesque tasks is borderline unbearable. And when things do inevitably go sideways, it's enough nightmare fuel for a trip to the moon and back. The rest of the story, however, is not as interesting as RE7's. It's just a campy horror story that thankfully doesn't take itself too seriously. The 4 lords are fine. Lady Dimitrescu had the internet fawning over her, Moreau is a fun side story, and Heisenberg, while presented as someone important to the story, doesn't really get a lot of screen time. His factory level is excellent though. The main villain is disappointingly just a generic evil witch lady that somehow manages to be less memorable than every single one of her minions. And look, Village is a great game for what it's trying to accomplish. I just wish they set out to accomplish something different, because Resident Evil 7 feels like such a unique video game. Yes, there are other games that have you being chased by people in tight corridors, but a lot of them feel like cheap jump scare simulators. Besides Alien Isolation, I don't think there's another game that uses this style of horror so well. Meanwhile, while Village is probably one of the best action horror games, I think you can find more good games like it in the genre, like Resi 4, Dead Space, Metro, and Alan Wake 2. While Village is great, you can find its style of gameplay and story in a lot of other places, but you can't find another Biohazard. I recognize that it's a weird thing to hold against the game, and I really liked it, but I can't help but think what could have been if Capcom went the opposite direction. And that brings us to Requiem. According to its Metacritic score, this is one of the 2 best original Resi games ever made. Time will only tell if that's true, but I can't help but think of the butterfly effect from 12 years ago that led to this exact game. If Capcom doesn't decide to evolve past their top-selling games ever, we probably never get Requiem. Capcom burned everything down and started over all this time ago, and as it seems, it's still enjoying the benefits of that choice more than a decade later. Thank you for watching this video. We're only 300 subs away from 1000, so if you want to see more videos like this one, boulder punch the subscribe button. For more franchise retrospectives, you can click here to watch why the Mafia franchise never reached its potential. See you in the next one.